Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first historical group lecture of the autumn. I'm particularly pleased this evening to welcome members of the Blackburn family to the lecture, and I'm sure you may well have some recollections of the Blackburn family to contribute in the discussion that we hope to have later. Professor Robert Blackburn is the Professor of Constitutional Law at King's College London and is also the Director of both the Centre for Political and Constitutional Studies and the Institute of Contemporary British History. He's the author of numerous books on political and constitutional affairs and is also a solicitor and a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. His current research activities include leading a major project on the UK Constitution, subject of a parliamentary inquiry, and he's preparing a book on the influence of Magna Carta today. And I'm sure we all know what Magna Carta means. Robert is the grandson of his namesake, Robert Blackburn, founder of the eponymous aircraft company. As a Yorkshireman, I've been looking forward very much to this evening, and I now invite Professor Blackburn to deliver his lecture.
Good. Well, many thanks for that, and it's a great pleasure to be here today and to say something about my grandfather. And it's a great pleasure also to have other members of the family here, particularly Janie and Sarah, Robert Blackburn's two surviving daughters by his second marriage. And I'm hoping at the end there'll be time for some questions, or perhaps not so much questions, but actually contributions from the audience here, because I'm mindful that not only Janie and Sarah will of course, remember Grandad when I was only 3 when Grandad died, but there will be many people here today, distinguished members and fellows of the Royal Aeronautical Society, who have much greater technological knowledge than I about aeronautical engineering. So I should first begin perhaps by declaring the nature of my own interest in the subject, apart from most obviously being the grandson of Robert Blackburn and obviously proud and interested in the family history. My main impressions of Grandad come principally, I suppose, from my father, who, although he never went into the Blackburn business, he flew all his life. He flew in the Second World War in the Fleet Air Arm, and when I was little, I was up and down in aeroplanes the whole time. My father had Tiger Moths and Cessnas, so I got a lot of my memories and recollections of my grandfather through my father, and also through my grandmother Jessica. Whilst Grandad Robert died when he was 70, Jessica lived on to the ripe old age of 101 and was obviously a great receptacle of knowledge. I mean, she was there right at the beginning. They married in 1914 as well. My other interest in the subject is an historian as well as a lawyer. I wear many caps, as you may have heard from the flattering introduction to me. And among the many projects I'm working on, I'm also working upon an illustrated book that will examine Blackburn Aircraft as a case study, I think, of social change in the UK in the first half of the 20th century, particularly, and even more particularly around Yorkshire and Hull. And the book, I think, will deal with government and public policy towards the aviation industry, especially in relation to defence, civil passenger transport, and the regulation of aerospace and the industry as a whole. So particular aspects which I'm already researching and look forward to writing upon, for example, would include the earliest forms of aviation regulation, legal regulation of airspace, when the earliest powered aeroplanes were being flown and tested at a time, of course, before the First World War, of German spy fever and the Zeppelins that came hovering across into the country. Other aspects I'll be looking at are the defence and foreign policy aspects of my grandfather's work for the Greek government during the 1920s, when Blackburn's was constructing really the first Greek air force just outside Athens at Old Phaleron. And I'll be looking forward to writing on the ideas and actions of particular government ministers, particularly Sir Stafford Cripps, as Minister of Aircraft Production from 1942 to 45 during the Second World War, a person whom my grandfather loathed, together with Cripps's periodic visits to his factory, and frequently referred to as Stifford Craps. However, today I've been asked to give a more personal perspective on Robert Blackburn rather than concentrate on the more academic aspects of the subject. And this is going to be aided by a large number of images, mostly photographs, from the very large family archive which I have. And I think it's true to say that to a large extent every picture tells a story. So today what I want to concentrate on is first of all outlining what I perceive to be his achievements and why he deserves to be regarded as one of the greats of early modern aviation. And I'll then look at a selection of his aircraft designs, ranging from, as I've given the title to the lecture, from the Mercury to the Buccaneer, this fascinating period of aviation history, I think, in the first half of the 20th century, from the very earliest weird and wonderful flying contraptions right through to the jet age, the Buccaneer being the last aircraft that was commissioned whilst he was alive. Then, subject to time, I'll spend some time looking at his early life, especially the period 1910 to 1914, the period being currently celebrated as the centenary of his pioneering work. This lecture is part of a rolling programme that myself and members of my family, Janie and Sarah, are putting together. That just about every month over that period something new was happening. It was a fascinating period. And so there are lots of pegs, if you like, and episodes to celebrate. Just a few weeks ago, I was up at Fili, where, of course, Grandad had his flying school in 1914 to 1912, and they've put several commemorative plaques up there. And I'm looking forward to organising some events in Leeds, which was the original heart of the Blackburn Company. And there's going to be a permanent exhibition in Roundhay Park, where there were a lot of flying exhibitions took place, and the engineering department of the university and the industrial museum at Leeds are also interested. So maybe I'll see some of you, as well as the family, at some of those other events in the future. I'm hoping then at the end, as I say, some of you will offer some of your own contributions. It would be fascinating to hear from any of you if you have any personal or vicarious experience of the Blackburn story, and or to hear from you either by email or telephone call later on. So here are three pictures of the great man, and I think it's interesting to look at them because one feature, I think, of Robert Blackburn is that he's not actually as widely known about as his contemporaries, the other greats, whether it's A.V. Roe or Tommy Sopwith or Handley Page. And he wasn't a great publicist, and there aren't, in fact, very many photographs of him in common circulation. But here he is. So I think the distinctions, to summarise before I go on to look at some of his aeroplanes, and to remind those of you who know perhaps less than others about my grandfather, he was the first Yorkshireman to design and fly an aeroplane. That was on the 20th of May 1910 on the East Yorkshire coast. And according to my calculations, but others here might correct me, he was the first UK national in the country to do so after Elliott Roe. Others, of course, flew in the country, but they were either not UK nationals or they were French-designed aeroplanes. And generally, in the earliest parts of powered flight, he exhibited and flew aeroplanes at most of the pre-1914 air national or regional air shows and operated famous flying schools at Fili between 1911 and 12 and subsequently at Hendon and then at Brough from 1916. He was the first to accomplish many feats. So in 1911, there was the first aeroplane to fly up the Yorkshire coast from Fili to Scarborough, watched by vast crowds at the time. 1911 also, from Fili, where the flying school was, as I've said, there was the first night flight in Yorkshire took place. In 1911 also, the first woman passenger was taken up in a Blackburn plane in Yorkshire, Miss Cook. Then in 1912, as the designs started to develop, there was the first all-metal monoplane, very distinctive at the time. In 1913, the first aircraft delivery of the Yorkshire Evening Post from Leeds to York was made by a Blackburn monoplane. In 1914, the first monoplane, a Blackburn plane, was supplied to the fleet. That was the Type 1 monoplane. And in 1919, a little later, he pioneered the first side-by-side two-seater. All two-seaters until then were in the front and behind. But Grandad was a firm believer that the future of flight was more sociable, where you were sitting next to one another and you could talk more clearly to one another. In 1924, I'm just selecting some distinctive aspects. He developed the Swift, which was capable of carrying a very large torpedo. And in 1923, there was the Kubaru, which was the largest aeroplane in the world in its day. And in fact, he pioneered other colossal air machines. And for some of you, you may know him best for these. The colossal Blackburn Beverley, of course, a transport carrier for the armed forces as well as for civil aviation. And also the vast seaplanes, the Iris, which I'll be showing you in a little bit as well. He was also a pioneer of new civil airline routes. In 1914, he could claim to be the first, to have conducted the first regular air service in the UK, which ran from Leeds to Bradford every half hour. In 1919, there was the first scheduled flight from Leeds to London, currently being celebrated at an exhibition at Leeds Bradford Airport. And at the same time, he was developing civil aviation lines over to Amsterdam, where he opened more regular flights. And later on, he opened up the first African air route, Cobham Blackburn Airlines, in collaboration with Alan Cobham. He also did some pioneering work abroad with the permission from the Defence and Foreign Offices for the Greek naval aircraft in Old Falerin outside Athens. So in the 1920s, hundreds of Blackburn workers went out there and worked the factory out there and produced particularly the Velos plane for the Greek and produced the first Greek Air Force for them. And in the process, he trained hundreds of local people in aeronautical engineer. He was also party to some of the spectacular air races that took place in the early years. And two, which were particularly pleasing to my grandfather, was 1913. There was a newspaper-sponsored air race that took place where Blackburns took on Avros, and it was called the Wars of the Roses, the Yorkshire people against the Lancastrians, and Blackburns won. In 1931, of course, Blackburns was regularly in the King's Cup, and it won in the year 1931 in the Blackburn Bluebird, which was a very popular plane at the time. And the Blackburn Company at Leeds, and therefore Grandad and his family, my grandmother, was at the centre of major aviation events in those early years. So, for example, when the pioneering US round-the-world flyers in 1924 stopped off in the UK, it was Brough that they stopped at and stayed 2 weeks as well, so seeing the Blackburn family every day. There were several royal visits to the Blackburn factory, particularly by Prince George in 1929 and 1940. And Winston Churchill himself took a close interest in Blackburn aircraft, actually sponsoring the Kangaroo, Blackburn Kangaroo aircraft in one of its earliest national air races. And Blackburn formed partnerships with many famous pilots of the day. B.C. Hucks, particularly well known, one of the early pioneering test pilots, the first person in the country to loop the loop. Amy Johnson learned to fly at the Blackburn Flying School. Alan Cobham, the Honourable Mrs. Victor Bruce, and other famous lady flyers, etc. Those early days must have been terrific fun, as well as very exciting in terms of the technological development. Blackburns, and Grandad, of course, made a major contribution to the World War II effort through their aircraft. I suppose two which deserve particular mention are the Skewer, which I'll show in a while, specifically developed as a dive bomber, and the Swordfish. Now, of course, all that was designed by Richard Fairey. Most of them were actually manufactured by Blackburn, so many of them came to be known as the Black Fish. So really deserve some Blackburn credit there, as well as Fairey's. And then, of course, for some perhaps the best known aircraft right at the end, the Buccaneer, which became the standard naval aircraft for several decades. So in social terms, Robert Blackburn and Blackburn Aircraft permeated Yorkshire life for 5 decades. There were air exhibitions, thousands of workers were at the Olympia Works in Leeds and at Brough, and almost daily press reports of what was going on. He was recognised with an OBE and the equivalent of a knighthood by the Greek government, their highest medal, the Gold Cross Order of the Redeemer, at a ceremony in Athens on the 10th of March 1927, attended by my grandmother as well and some members of the family. But curiously, he was overlooked for a knighthood by the British government, when all the other major aviation pioneers received one. Elliott Roe was knighted in 1928, Frederick Hanley Page in 1942, and Tommy Sopwith in 1953. It is, I'd suggest, a curious omission. Some at Brough believe it's the north of Watford factor. So I now move to look at some of the aeroplanes, and this was the first monoplane, worked on in 1909, and which flew, I think what I would have to say, partially successfully, as was A.V. Roe's earliest attempts as well, in a series really of long hops. It was built in a small workshop in Leeds with a 35 horsepower green engine, and the pilot, Robert Blackburn himself, was positioned below the wings and engine, sitting on a wicker chair taken from his father's garden. It successfully flew, as I say, in a series of long hops on the 20th of May 1910 at Saltburn on the East Yorkshire coast, but then side-slipped on attempting a turn and crashed. Even if this design was abandoned subsequently by Grandad, it did establish his name in the aviation world as a serious and leading aeronautical engineer, and the design was favourably reported on by Flight magazine. Then there was his second design. There was a cluster, I think one would say, of designs roughly around this shape. And the monoplane was quite distinctive because the Avro, for example, was triplanes, 3 wings or two wings. So going with a monoplane, putting his eggs in that basket, was a very distinctive contribution of Blackburn's at that time. It did owe something, of course, to the French Antoinette aeroplane, which had been developed in France, but did have substantial modifications made to it in the features relating to it, in the hull, the style of wings, and the tailgate. This design was tested at the flying school in Fili and had its first successful launch on the 8th of March 1911, flown by B.C. Hucks. Now, these, as I say, this design, there are several of them. Not many was made of each particular one, but there's the second monoplane, which became the Mercury, and there was the Mercury 1, 2, 3. And then there was the Type E, developed in 1911, which was the military all-metal aeroplane. They were all fairly similar, and I'll show you here just a few of them. On Fili Beach, a wonderful photograph. There's Grandad with one of the Mercuries. There is the Type E, the military all-metal design. And a two-seater version. And the single-seat monoplane. Now, this is worth dwelling on for a little while. Only one of these was built, and it was a variant of the Mercury, but a one-seater, whereas most of the Mercuries were two-seaters. And it was built to the order of Cyril E. Foggin. It was tested by another of Blackburn's test pilots, Harold Blackburn, no relation, in late 1912, and then it was flown during the week of the 21st of March 1913 by Mr. Foggin himself during a week of demonstrations at Lofthouse Park, Leeds. Now, remarkably, it survives today at Shuttleworth and is the oldest original aeroplane, certainly in the UK, if not in the world, still in existence, capable of flying. So for those of you who've been to Shuttleworth, there's a fantastic museum and collection of old aircraft. They have reconstructed some of the old Avro planes and one or two others, but those are reconstructions. Quite a lot of them were actually made for the film Those Magnificent Men in Their Flying Machines. But the Blackburn Monoplane is an original. And if anyone knows of any other earlier aeroplane in the world that still flies, please let me know, because I think another interesting aspect is that it is still the oldest flying aircraft in the world. Good. This was the 1912 monoplane flying just a few weeks ago at Shuttleworth. I was lucky enough to sit inside, which you probably just saw a picture of me in, and it had just 3 controls in it: a throttle, an on-off switch, and the steering wheel. The pilots who actually took it up commented on it that it's remarkably stable to take up, but it'll only fly if conditions are absolutely perfect. While I'm doing the movies, I was going to show this later on, but I thought I'd show you this clip that I got from Pathé News, which shows the enormous Iris seaplane. And this was its inaugural flight in 1929. And here's the White Falcon, moving on. There was only one of these made. It was custom made for Roland Ding, who is another of Grandad's test pilots, a very famous character at the time in Yorkshire. And it was made for Ding personally, who had his own flying instruction and joyriding business as well himself, mainly at Windermere. I'll say more about Roland Ding later. It was a 2-seater, similar in design to the Type 1 2-seater version of the single-seat monoplane. Then, as the design moved on from the monoplane, there was the Type L seaplane, and the TB seaplane, the BE2, a Farnborough design, but it was made by Blackburns and other companies for the government. Robert Blackburn received his first order for these personally from Winston Churchill at the Admiralty the day after his wedding in 1914. And there's another picture as well. And then one of my favourite Blackburn aircraft, the Kangaroo. This was designed as a reconnaissance torpedo type aircraft. It had a wooden frame and covered in fabric and was manufactured at the Olympia Works in Leeds. Its maximum speed was 114 miles an hour. It was used initially for military purposes in the First World War, carrying bombs and reconnaissance, but later it was used for commercial purposes and ran the commercial line to Amsterdam. Then there's the Kubaru, This was made to Air Ministry specifications to serve as a long-distance coastal defence aeroplane capable of carrying a large torpedo load. It was the largest single-engine aircraft in the world in its day, capable of carrying a 1.5-ton torpedo. And then there was the Velos, most of which were made for the Greek government. It was a torpedo biplane with dual control or capacity for one pilot to serve as a gunner. And then the popular Bluebird in 1928. This was a popular, user-friendly biplane for private owners, developed for club training and flying. It won several competitions in its early years. In its inaugural year, 1926, the Yorkshire Aeroplane Club's 25-mile open handicap, and various other competitions such as the Grosvenor Challenge Cup later on in September. There is a float version of it as well. The Lincock, that was entered in the 1928 two-day King's Cup Air Race. And then there are the enormous seaplanes, which I showed in the movie Pathé clip just there. There's the Iris in 1929, a huge aircraft. It was a biplane with an all-metal hull and powered by three powerful 650 horsepower Rolls-Royce engines fitted between two main wings. And the Perth. Then, entering slightly more modern periods, there is the B2. The B2, there's a B2 in fact still in existence and flying, a beautiful two-seater side by side. Amy and I sat in it at the Shuttleworth collection just a few weeks ago. And it had its maiden flight at Brough in 1931. It was a durable training aircraft, built principally for the RAF and for the reserve training. And then the Shark. This was put in for tender against the Swordfish, and the Swordfish won the tender, and most of those were actually constructed and used. But a fair number of the Shark planes were actually used by the Fleet Aeron. Then the Skua, 192 of these were built. It was the only British aeroplane of its day designed exclusively as a dive bomber fighter. It had folding wings and served on various aircraft carriers, including Ark Royal. It was the first British aircraft in the Second World War to have a strike against a German one. On the 26th of September 1939, it shot down a German Dornier flying boat that was shadowing a damaged British submarine. And then, of course, the Swordfish, or Blackfish, as I've referred to it. This famous aircraft, as I've said, was designed by FRHistS, but deserves to be mentioned in any list of Blackburn planes because so many of them were constructed, 1,700 in total, more than twice as many as FRHistS themselves. Then moving on to a plane I mentioned earlier, the colossal Blackburn Beverley proved very popular for military purposes. A typical load, believe it or not, was 9 jeeps, 81 troops and 38 paratroops, 1 angle-dozer fully fuelled, 1 large anti-aircraft gun, 3 army vehicles and 1 bulldozer plus accessories. So a vast load. And then, of course, the Buccaneer. In 1952, the Admiralty decided it wanted a high-speed, low-level bomber strike aircraft operating below the radar using the new missile technology. Whereas previously virtually all bombers were relatively slow aircraft operating from high altitude. Originally called the NA-39, it became the Buccaneer. And there on the Ark Royal. And there at Farnborough. And an old model of it, a redundant model of it, was kept on the forecourt at Yeovilton for a long time. I think it's back inside now, but there's my son standing just below it. And there's a cluster of family members, including Janie, Sarah, and myself. Not Sarah Willis on that occasion, up at Prof. So just a little bit about the history of the Blackburn Company before I go on to the early flight. For those who don't know. So to begin with, of course, it was a private business, and Robert Blackburn worked out of workshops provided largely by his father, George, at Benson Street and then Barn Road. And then the Blackburn Flying School was established at Fili. The works or manufacture took place in the Olympia Works in Leeds, and then in parts it was wheeled, taken by horse and carriage over to the East Coast for test piloting them. In the early days, although it had been much easier to have tested them at Roundhay Park, the local council was worried about the safety of these early flying machines, and so wouldn't grant permission. Later on, when times became more pressing during the First World War, Roundhay Park, right in the heart of Leeds as a city, was used for test piloting airplanes at that time. So in 1914, when the company was really set up, the Olympia Works was acquired. It was incorporated as the Blackburn Aeroplane and Motor Company. And in 1916, the Brough site near Hull on the Humber was acquired specifically to test seaplanes at the time, because Grandad obviously specialised in naval aircraft or aircraft for the Navy. The Leeds remained the main headquarters, though through into the 1920s. So there was a reincorporation in 1936, as you can see, a new factory at Dumbarton, and in 1939 a new factory at Sherburn and Elmet, which specialised in manufacturing the swordfish. And then in 1949, as orders began to dry up, in 1949, it merged with General Aircraft. And then after Grandad died in 1955, later on the company was taken over by Hawker Siddeley's, and then subsequently taken over by British Aerospace, now BAE Systems. So it is amazing. The Brough site, founded in 1916 by Grandad, is still there and very much operational. And over the years there have been vicissitudes, all sorts of problems, industrial disputes, drying up of orders and redundancies, but somehow Brough has always managed to survive. And within BAE Systems, I think it's true to say that it's never known as BAE Systems, the one outside Hull. It's always known as Brough. Brough is an institution in its own right. And it's rather lovely that BAE Systems has always enjoyed and celebrated its ancestry in Blackburn Aircraft. And if you go up there, there's a Robert Blackburn Road, and there's a very active heritage centre there as well. Compensating, I think, for when Hawkers took it over because Blackburn's was a well-known brand. They tried to bury the Blackburn brand and promote Hawkers, but it's been brought back in latter years. Now, in the time available, I'll say a little bit about Robert Blackburn's early life and how he got involved in the aeroplane business. And he was born in Kirkstall, Leeds, on the 26th of March, 1885, the son of George Blackburn and his wife Kate, who lived at 18 Spencer Place, Roundhay Road, Leeds. And here are his parents, then, of course. He was the second of 7 children, with an elder sister, Dorothy, then after him, Hilda, Spencer, Marjorie, Norman, and Charles. His family were very important to him, and he included them in the family to as much of an extent as he could. His brothers Spencer, Charles and Norman all joined with him in the early days, but then Spencer, who later on died early of TB in the 1920s, during the First World War, decided to go his own way and set up his own motor car company in Leeds itself. But Norman and Charles remained with the business. There was quite a big age difference. Norman was about 10 years younger than Robert, and Charles, of course, even more so. Charles was the baby of the family. But they became important figures in the family, in the management of the business. Norman himself could fly. He ran the flying school, training other pilots, and he ran some of the factories, notably the Sherburn factory of the Swordfish during the Second World War. Charles Blackburn handled the insurance and public relations side of the business. And there were other relatives in the business as well, notably Bobby Rhodes, who was on Jess's side, his first wife's side, the nephew of one of Granny's sisters. Now, his father was a heavy engineer. He was a works director at Green's in Leeds. And he was brought up then in the idea of manufacturing these machines like that, or heavy roller machines. And Thomas Green's was a well-established heavy engineering company. The first picture I have of Grandad is here, taken, I think, about 1890. And if I'm correct, that, I think, is Grandad up there with two of his sisters and his mother and father down here. And he went first to Leeds Modern School between 1898 and 1903. And then, subsequently, he went to study civil engineering at Leeds University, which it became, Leeds College at the time, between 1903 and 1906. And I think one of the two, I think, most influential factors upon him, the other one I'll say something about in a moment, being over in France when it was all happening, 1907, 1908, in terms of great flight. But he was fortunate to have been taught there by Professor John Goodman, the Professor of Civil and Mechanical Engineering and Head of Department. Goodman had not only written a leading work on mechanical engineering, mechanics applied to engineering in 1906, and the leading text on the subject at the time, but two features of his teaching stand out, and they're particularly of interest to me, being a university teacher myself. The first was open book examinations, quite modern, the idea of being able to take in whatever materials you actually like. But for him, the emphasis was very much on applying the knowledge you have rather than rote learning and how good your memory was. So allowing students to concentrate on ideas and the application of knowledge rather than regurgitating facts. And secondly, quite unusual at the time, instead of teaching with toy apparatus to prove mechanical theories, students conducted their practical laboratory exercises and experiments on full-size machines. And certainly that continues today. I was in the mechanical engineering at Leeds only a few weeks ago, and the students there are working on life-size machines still. Now, in the year that Robert left the university, he was made an associate member of the Institute of Civil Engineers, which was a distinction, and this would almost certainly have been on a glowing reference from Professor Goodman. I think the creative approach of Professor Goodman towards his teaching, the practical application of it, and how principles could be forged towards new inventions rather than continuing or improving existing knowledge and technology, largely explains, perhaps, Robert Blackburn's restlessness about just going into the family firm, but actually wanting to forge out and strike out and invent something new altogether. After he graduated, he worked for a while at Green's, but found it difficult to knuckle down and follow in his father's footsteps. So his father, who was always highly supportive of his son, even though he was unhappy with his decisions from time to time, fixed him up with some work experience abroad with commercial contacts he had in Germany, Belgium, and France. And then Robert's presence in France, working at a civil engineering consultancy firm in Rouen, in particular in 1908, proved a turning point in his life. Because 1908, of course, was a key period in the development of European aviation. On the 13th of January 1908, there was the first powered flight in Europe by Henri Farman, English-born but a French national, flying a circular course for half a mile in a biplane. And then on the 8th of August 1908, Wilbur Wright started a series of demonstration flights at Le Mans in his Wright's Flyer, travelling in controlled circular flights of approximately 1 minute 45 seconds. And as my grandfather recounted later on, in a speech he made, our office hours were 6 days a week until 5 Saturday afternoon. For several Sundays, I would race up to Paris to witness demonstrations by the Wright brothers, Farman, Blériot, and Latham on his graceful Antoinette. Once or twice I failed to turn up for duty at the office on Monday morning. On my last visit from Rouen, I felt so ashamed when I arrived back for work late on the Tuesday, and feeling that I'd be reprimanded and perhaps given the sack, that I approached my employer first and told him of my Paris exploits, the state of restlessness that had come over me, and that it would be better that I should leave. I'd witnessed with and fascinated by these earlier flights of a few minutes, studied with a student's curiosity the various stress structures, etc., and he wanted to embark on formulating his own conception of the design on paper. So he left, and for several months he lived in a top-floor room in Paris, setting about his own design for an aeroplane. And during this period, there was one of the first exhibitions in Paris, and his parents came over to see him to find out what the hell was going on, and he managed to persuade them to go along to this exhibition, and George felt, maybe there's something in this. So when Robert came back to Leeds, his father found a workshop for him and seconded a couple of workmen from the Greens Engineering Company, and Robert set to work. So when he did set to work, what type of design would he go for? As we know, he went for the monoplane design. But the type of contraptions that he was comparing himself with at that time looked like that. Or that's the Wright Flyer. That's AV Row, the triplane. And a French design, believe it or not, was thought at some point to be the way of the future. And I think that particular design may have to some extent influenced his first design, which I've already shown you. That machine attracted a lot of attention in the local press. There's from a cutting at the time. So the first flight took place at Saltburn. In parts it was taken up to the East Yorkshire coast. And it was assembled there, and Grandad himself flew the machine. And there's the location where it flew, and the plane again, as I showed you earlier on. And the romantic side of it commemorated in a picture which went out as a Blackburn calendar at the time. The original drawing of which Janie has in her sitting room. But, as I've said, he decided to go ahead with a different design for his second machine. That's a picture of the hangar at Fili. Now, for reasons of time, I won't say more about the early flight, but perhaps I can quickly go through show you some of these photographs. That's BC Hux in the middle. These are photographs of the first flight between Fili and Scarborough, which was a sensational event at the time. And the pictures here I'm showing just illustrate the great popular attraction of early flight, people not really knowing what would this wonderful technology be used for. And I'm trying to put together cartoons from the early period as well, because there are lots of amusing stories or ideas about what it could be used for, watering gardens and things like that from overhead. But the air races, of course, were fantastic events and good showpieces, of course, for the aeroplanes themselves. B.C. Hucks went on a famous West Country tour in a Blackburn monoplane, achieving quite a lot of firsts along the way as well. The first person to fly over the Bristol Channel. He managed to have telepathic communications with someone on the ground while he was up there as well. There he is going over the Bristol Channel. And as I've said, Mr. Hucks was the first to loop the loop in the country in a Blackburn monoplane, and he later, for the newspapers, drew how he did it. And a few more images from the air races themselves. That was the Blackburn entrant. That was the Avro entry. And Blackburn's won. There's a picture with the 1913 Cup with Harold Blackburn, as my grandfather, of course, the editor of the Yorkshire Post, and the owner of the aircraft as well, Mr. Christie, I think. And it's very nice that in this centenary programme of events, it's been rather lovely that I've met certain people who I didn't know exist before, but one of them was when I was up in Fili, I met Harold Blackburn's grandson, Mike Stanberry and who at a previous meeting had brought the cup along, because his granddad gave the cup to him in about 1950, brought it up to show us, which Janie saw as well at the time. And it's worth, I think, mentioning the early test pilots. These were not only were they the most popular, more famous perhaps than the designers in their day, great circus entertainers as well, but very heroic people, because it was very dangerous, of course, flying these early flying contraptions. B.C. Hucks was one of the test pilots. Of course, he survived fine. But there were some casualties along the way. The other test pilots were Herbert Oxley, and in fact, Herbert Oxley is here in this monoplane, which sadly crashed shortly after this photograph was actually taken, going over the side of a cliff too fast and not being able to come up in time before it hit the bottom. Jack Brereton, another test pilot, he survived, a brave man. Harold Blackburn, having postcards and having them signed was very popular at the time, of course. Laurie Spink, particularly test piloted down at Hendon and at the flying school, taught people to fly. And then, if I dwell just a little bit longer, on Roland Ding. Roland Ding was a very well-known local character in Yorkshire, as I know, and he had his own business in 1917. And again, of the acquaintances that I've made over the last few years, I'm close friends now with his grandson, Roland Burley, who was a pilot with Cathay Pacific. Roland Ding, unfortunately, crashed to his death in 1917, test piloting an aircraft in Roundhay Park. The wing suddenly gave in, and he'd done a few loop-the-loops. Then one of the wings collapsed, and he went into a spin and came down, and it was a fatal crash. And that crash I think struck the local imagination and has been remembered for many years. Even now, occasionally in the press, it's made, and we're going to have some sort of commemoration to Roland Ding up in Leeds, certainly in 2017, to commemorate the centenary of his death. I mean, there's a mark on the location where he came down. And afterwards, a plaque was made in his memory and put up on the gates outside Blackburn Aircraft at Olympia Works. But I'm afraid to say that there were other fatalities. This is not Blackburn's, but from another company, crashes. And there were some more amusing, perhaps, crashes that took place on Blackburn planes. This one was not fatal, the pilot was fine, but this was the Kangaroo in the England to Australia race, which came down looking like that in Crete. And probably the most worrying of all, but Blackburn's wasn't the only person who had trouble sometimes with their designs. There's A.V. Rowe in one of his crashed aeroplanes as well. Now, I think if I can abuse my time here, in just the last 5 minutes, I might just look at some selected issues. There's many aspects I could have. Great. Now, in times of commercial austerity, as it were, particularly after the two world wars, when government contracts dried up, Blackburn's had to diversify. And I think it's worth dwelling on that Robert Blackburn was an aircraft designer first and foremost, but he could turn his hand to other ideas and other contraptions when he wanted to. Just a few of these, although it really came to naught, he was interested in the idea of motor-powered boats. And in fact, one, the Mary Gordon, I think is still, in fact, on the park at Roundhay Park, on the lake there. He was also made motor-powered sleighs for Ernest Shackleton for his expeditions to the South Pole. And he was a great lover of cars. He had some wonderful cars himself, reputed to be the first person in Leeds to own and drive a car, motor vehicle. But these are a few of the machines that he produced. And two of his own cars, I think that's an Elvis. I'm not so sure about that. I think that might be a Rolls. And then, forgive me those of you who've seen me give a presentation before, my own favourite, the Roma Hut. Now, the idea of a Roma Hut was that when you were going out for the day, you could put together a little house in a cabin that you pulled along behind you. So here you are, the family going out for an outing on the day, driving down the road, stopping off where you want to have your picnic and starting to disassemble everything, laying it out neatly on the garden floor, putting it up, and then enjoy. And these Roma huts, believe it or not, were very successful at the time. Obviously, there's a certain novelty value to them. And of course, he was also making prefabricated houses too, up in the north of England, up in Scotland as well. And then, when you've had enough of your day out, He put it back again in its box and drove back home. I've mentioned just flitting from one little subject to the next for reasons of time. Here's a cartoon from the early days. What will we make of it all? And here's the idea of a cartoonist that an aeroplane, a monoplane, could be used for ordering, for gardening work, watering the garden. So very briefly to end up with, and I've said something about what I think Grandad's achievements were, which were remarkable, I think, and he deserves to be regarded as one of the greats of British aviation. He deserves, more than deserves, the celebrations we're having in the centenary programme, which are ongoing. Just to very quickly flick through, again, a short number of the aeroplane contraptions that he built. Good. Well, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Robert. I can't help feeling that if only he'd taken out a patent for water bombing forest fires, he would have been made for life. So we move into a discussion and question period. If you have a question or you'd like to add to the discussion, please indicate, and one of my colleagues will bring a microphone to you.
On the 1st of January 49, Blackburn and General Aircraft merged, and I've always been interested in this period. First of all, do any of the General Aircraft archives still exist within, whether it's Hawker Siddeley or BAE, or whoever has all the old documents now?
It's a good point. I haven't come across any. The archival material that I have come across is quite patchy. There's quite a lot, particularly on the early days, still at Brough. Of that particular period, I haven't seen much documentation. Does anyone else can answer that? Yeah.
Okay. Then the other, sorry.
I don't know about the General Aircraft minutes, but at the RAF Museum we have some Blackburn minutes, certainly going back to the North Sea Aerial Transport Company, which was the airline. I think the Blackburn Aircraft Company minutes go back that sort of quite a way back and reasonably far up to date, but I don't know about General Aircraft.
Oh, thank you. And then the other thing is that in 49, almost the first project which the joint organisation put forward was, I didn't realise this, was a transonic Sapphire-powered swing wing design, which went through from 49 to 51. It was passed to RAE and backwards and forwards with the ministry, but I've never seen any drawings of this. No, there again, that's just a question. And then the third thing is Norbert Edward Rowe. He was known as Nero. He was the Director of Technical Development with the Ministry of Aircraft Production, and then after the Miles M52 was cancelled, he left the civil service, went to BEA for 5 years, and then went to Blackburn as the Technical Director. And he worked his way up, and I think he became almost like the commercial director. He was involved with the Buccaneer and so on. And again, I wonder whether you might know where perhaps his papers might be. Thank you.
Can I just answer that last gentleman's query? I've been in touch with Paul Lawson, who runs the archives at Brough, and I have been up there. And in fact, I was having an email conversation with him today, and he confirmed that they're still only part way through cataloguing what they have. And it won't come as a surprise to you that they're very under-resourced there. BAE don't give them much money. It's all run on volunteer help. So there might well be the General Aircraft Archives there, and they just haven't got round to cataloguing them yet.
Yeah. The Heritage Centre there has done a fantastic job, though, over the last 15, 20 years. Eric Barker particularly kicking it going, because before that they were in a terrible state. So they are getting there. So there may be some help as they get round to that period. Could I ask Janie and Sarah if they'd like to make any comments or offer any perspectives on Grandad?
It's amazing. I'm thrilled that you did all the talking today, because there's so much that I didn't know. And I don't think I can possibly add anything about the flying days of Grandpa, because I think your knowledge and your research is far and away beyond the knowledge that we have. And I was 17 when Dad died, and I wish I'd had more time to talk to him, but I learnt more about him in the recent years through you and through the centenaries than I ever knew about him when he was alive. Apart from he was my dad and we loved him very much. So technically I don't think I can add anything, Robert, and I think you've done the most brilliant job in all the research and the fabulous photographs and bringing it all alive for all of us.
It'll all come together in the book eventually, hopefully 2014 we'll have a big book launch.
It's going to be a very big book. It's getting bigger by the time. Have you anything to say, Sarah? Okay, thank you so much.
I would love to know if there's any record. I think you were talking about the social history of this period. I would love to know if there's any record of the reactions of local people in 1912 and 13 to the sight of aeroplanes flying around Fili.
Well, it's a good point, and it's something I want to try and go into in more depth myself. It's not so difficult looking at a first obvious place to look at is just the local press. And when you do look at the local press, you know, the Yorkshire Evening Post, the Yorkshire Post, and even more local ones like the Fili, Mercury, or whatever it's called, and up in Scarborough, there are references to aviation developments really every week, if not, you know, every other day. So it certainly struck the popular imagination. And in a period where there wasn't television and even radio in those early days, I mean, it was a day's outing. It was a form of entertainment. I suppose it was the First World War that made aviation serious, in a sense. And I think one needs to remember also that by no means was it clear that aeroplanes would be the future of civil transport, but particularly human transport. I'd have thought probably right into, you know, the 1930s, because the large people carriers in the air were really the airships, and it was only after a succession of Zeppelin and R-101 disasters that aeroplanes came into their own. Otherwise, there is a little bit of oral history around what people thought, and in various sort of bits and pieces I've managed to put together from letters from people, recollections from what their parents said to them as well, letters from the early days, people who worked in the factory, and as I say, there were hundreds of them. There is a fair amount of material there that can be put into shape to reflect popular attitudes to what was going on. Almost generally, I'd say it was regarded as a very benevolent, popular activity. So it was regarded as a sort of thrilling, positive thing.
You showed a picture of a Buccaneer preserved somewhere, and I can't remember where it was, but I wondered, were you aware of the one that's preserved in the Connecticut headquarters at Farnborough?
Yes, although I haven't been down there to see it. I go to Farnborough remarkably rarely, I regret to say, but I do need to, when I get down to finishing off my writing on this, need to spend a considerable amount of time down there. There are a lot of museums and archives around the country, in fact, to explore. You could spend your whole life doing it, in fact. And of course, there's Yeovilton, there's a rich amount of Blackburn material around there. The National Science, the Science Museum in South Kensington has a fair amount of material too.
Question at the back.
In the middle 50s, when we were still a real country, several UK aircraft manufacturers were tasked with producing designs or schemes for, I suppose you would call it a space shuttle for the RAF, for their manned programme, which was cancelled in June, July 1960. I'm guessing that Blackburn must have been one of the companies which were invited to tender or provide a scheme. Are you aware of any such scheme by Blackburn?
No, sounds interesting though. I'll try and do some digging.
I'd like to pick up one or two of the remarks that just recently been made. You can actually see and hear Buccaneers rolling along the concrete at Bruntingthorpe, I think it is, where they have about 5 that they can power up and trundle around. They're not supposed to get airborne, but that's a sight to be seen. To come back to earlier days, in terms of planes versus airships, in 1924, with the new government that came in, they said airships will replace aeroplanes as the means of transport, and that was the gestation of the R100 and the R101. But as you say, the disaster of R101 in 1930 really. Did I say 1934 just now? I'm supposed to have said 1924, whatever I said. But in 1930, of course, the crash of R101 brought that to an end. But another point, and a further point about the very earliest of days of flying, and you've really alluded to this too, that and it was true for so many pilots in the First World War, that they had no opportunity to operate anything mechanical, and because cars were very rare, hardly anybody would have a car, and then pilots were getting airborne and having to teach themselves to fly. So it was a very very innovative period and a very challenging time for the pilots to learn not only about learn about controlling a beast in 3 dimensions.
A recollection and a question. Recollection is in the mid-50s, I think probably 1954, as a schoolboy, I was invited up to Brough for a week during the summer holidays as guest of the company, just to look around and see what they did. And looking back on, they gave us an absolutely wonderful time. We didn't actually get to fly in the prototype General Freighter because it went unserviceable when they were going to take us up. But looking back on this, I get the impression of a company that was very concerned to attract people into it, particularly technical people, and very willing to invest in that. And I wonder if you or other people have that same impression. The question is, at what stage after 1910 did Robert Blackburn's enterprise become financially viable, in that it was new aeroplanes being paid for by clients rather than with family money, which I think is what got it going initially?
Thanks. Well, to answer your second question first, I'm not entirely sure without trawling through the books and accounts, and I'm not, well, I think you can trawl through them to a limited extent, but they're fairly patchy, but the earliest ones are difficult. Certainly he was subsidised, as it were, right from the outset, with money that came from my grandmother in 1914 and help from his father. So that set the business up. But the early planes, quite a few of them were specifically made to order, like Cyril Foggin's aeroplane, etc. It was with the outbreak of the war and the first order of, I think, 14 BE-2s from the government that started making it financially viable, I suppose, the First World War. So then there was a crisis afterwards, and a lot of, as I said, some of the like the flights to Amsterdam, which were partially successful, trying to open up new routes. Getting the Greek contract, I think, was quite important in the 1920s. I mean, that was highly lucrative, and that helped the company in a big way. And then it was really, I think, through imagination, the Bluebird, I think Grandad realising that people want to sit next to one another, that you need designer planes specifically for joyriding rather than giving them just a plane that might be adapted from a military purpose aeroplane. I think it was living on their wits that actually made them survive. But I've no doubt that my grandfather always felt that it was a financially risky business right to the end. On your first point, and this relates back to what the lady said earlier on and social attitudes to it, it strikes me quite strongly from looking at all the archives and materials that insofar as a company, a large company, can ever be a happy family, it was a very paternalistic form of company, that there really was a sense of obligation to the workforce to look after them. Shown in all sorts of little ways. So, I mean, just Grandad bringing the family in, as it were, to the business to start with. But there were very active social clubs, sporting activities of all for the women as well as the men. And he was a strong believer in apprenticeships. And that still, I think, remains very strong in Brough today, actually, as a tradition. So all these things, I think, it was very much part of the local area, and there was a feeling of sense of obligation, loyalty to the firm, but also paternalistic looking after the workforce as well.
Yes, that lines up very much with the impression I got when I was up there.
Question at the back.
When I used to go up to Brough, occasionally we used to go out to Home on Spalding Moor. When was that part of the Blackburn Aircraft Company when your grandfather was around?
I'm not absolutely sure, I'm afraid, but it does ring a bell. That's all I can say. I don't know whether anybody else can answer that.
The Home on Spalding Moor was, I think, bought, if not leased, from the ministry as a test aircraft for a test airfield, for the Buccaneer, and Brough also worked on the Phantom, which certainly couldn't get in or out of Brough. So
It was on the Buccaneer I used to go up there, but on the avionics side and that side of testing. But it wasn't about, it was much later than your grandfather.
I'm not sure, I'm afraid.
yeah, I think
I don't know whether anybody else can help.
I think Home on Spalding Moor came into use, particularly when the Buccaneer started flying.
We went up to Spalding Moor and had a look around the flight test equipment setup, which was very advanced for its day.
I'm very interested in the twin-fused large seaplane in the First World War. Do you know if they were successful when you were flown? Because my father was involved in the testing of them for the Royal Naval Air Service. And the problem was that the pilot had difficulty in controlling the engine. And of course, Dad, being the mechanic and the observer, had to get out and go and start the engine again. And this happened several times, and of course he said it was you know, very slippery to do this. So I don't think they managed to take off. I don't know if you know anything about that particular aircraft you showed.
No, I don't think many of them were produced.
It was interesting that your grandfather was a civil engineer, and also, of course, Barnes Wallis was. Barnes Wallis was working on airships, and your grandfather was on big aircraft. So I think this might tie in with what my neighbour was saying just now. But coming back to the other point you made, was about the lack of mechanical control and driving of cars in the First World War. So there weren't many people who had done that. And so I think this was a difficulty with the pilots. But do you know, I just wondered if you knew anything about that particular aircraft. Do you know, was it only one made or?
No, but you might find it out by, there's a very good book on the technological history of Blackburn Aircraft by A.J. Jackson. I would think it's probably you'd find it in there.
Thank you.
I think, okay, 2 more questions.
You mentioned the Blackburn skewer. What about the Blackburn rock that was like the Defiant and had a power-operated turret? Were many produced?
Yes, it was quite a successful aircraft. Nothing like as many as the skewer. I mean, I couldn't show all the aircraft today, but the rock, you know, was a successful Blackburn design.
Do you think the power-operated turret one ever went into action? The one with the 4 guns. And how many guns did the skewer have?
I'm afraid these are far more detailed questions than I can answer.
I have to say, off the top of my head, I can't quite answer those questions either.
But so I say, you'll almost certainly find it in that history of Blackburn Aircraft by Jackson, which has got all these technical details in it. It's a great book.
Okay. And question back, please.
Returning again to when we were still a real country in the middle 50s, there was a scheme, I believe, for a much improved Beverley with turboprops. And the reason for that, as I understand, was to carry both the English Electric and the de Havilland satellite launch vehicle come long-range ballistic missiles. Have you come across any information as to the size of the vehicles they were asked to carry?
Again, I think this is technical stuff that you'd probably find in the technical history.
I think the role was eventually, or the aircraft that was eventually designed for that role was the Belfast. But of course, as soon as it was built, the role had become redundant because the missile project had been cancelled.
The first aircraft that I know of for certain, which was schemed to carry them, was a wide-bodied variant of the V1000, the Vickers V1000 in 53 or 54. But there's very little. It almost seems to be sanitised out of history because you can find very, very little, very few details. So, but I believe that all the large transport aircraft of that period, middle 50s, you know, Bristol Shorts, etc., were all designed specifically to carry that as the primary. It was their primary reason for existence was to carry those vehicles, rockets.
I'd like now to ask Mick Oakey, please, to propose a vote of thanks.
Right. Well, Professor Blackburn, you've given us a multifaceted evening. In terms of the products of the Blackburn Aircraft Company, you've taken us on a journey through a diverse range of aeroplanes, from the elegant, the 1912 monoplane and the Bluebird, through the gigantic, the Kubaru, the Iris flying boat and the Beverley, to the slightly scarily purposeful, never better personified than the Buccaneer. And without wishing to be in the least bit cheeky, aviation history enthusiasts also regard Blackburn Aircraft as the source of some of the ugliest aeroplanes ever produced, notably in the UK, notably the Blackburn and the Blackburn Blackbird, which sadly we didn't see pictures of today, but which in the 1920s actually rivaled the undisputed masters of aeronautical ugliness, the French, which is no mean achievement. Now, the other things you've done tonight, you've taken us off the beaten track, looking at things like the motorized sledges and the wonderful Roma Hut, which I think was new to all of us. But the main thing is the personal connection. At the beginning of this evening, you said that Robert Blackburn doesn't have the same high profile as some of the other pioneers in the UK, and that perhaps he didn't receive the recognition he deserved. And I think you've absolutely tonight put him back on the map for us. Now, from any speaker, that would have been an achievement which would have sent us away satisfied. But for that to have been given to us by somebody who is able to refer to his subject as Grandad really makes it something very out of the ordinary. And not only that, but to be able to do so in the presence of several further members of the family really turns it into a very special evening indeed. So, quite apart from everybody in the room, I think, looking forward to seeing your book when it comes out, I'm certain that everybody will want to join me in thanking you for a fascinating talk.